Good afternoon. I'm Mary Brinton, Director of the Reischauer Institute of Japanese Studies, and I'd like to welcome you to the program on U.S.-Japan Relations seminar for today. We are very happy to welcome Eunmi Mun. Let me first say that the seminar is part of the special series on policy innovations in crises, supported by a grant from the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership, CGP. And also this seminar is co-sponsored by the Masavar Ramani Center for Business and Government in the Harvard Kennedy School and by the Department of Sociology at Harvard. Our speaker, Eunmi Mun, is well known to many of us. She's a PhD from my own department here at Harvard, sociology. And she came to sociology at Harvard after getting a BA and an MA at Seoul National University. Eunmi works in the area of gender and organizations, law and organizations, work-family policies, labor market institutions, and in general work and employment in East Asia, principally Japan and Korea. She is currently an assistant professor at the School of Labor and Employment Relations at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And prior to that, she taught at Amherst College in the Department of Anthropology and Sociology. Eunmi has published very widely, especially in sociological journals, on work and organizations, corporate governance, and gender relations and inequality in organizations in Japan. So she has a very long list of publications, and we're very happy to welcome her to present today on lifetime advantage at the top, the norm of lifetime employment and CEO succession in Japan. And this is work I believe that she's doing with Hiroshi Ono and Jiuk Jung. So welcome back, Eunmi, to Harvard. She was also a U.S.-Japan relations postdoc, which I forgot to mention. So that's very relevant for this audience. This slide that's showing now just shows the upcoming seminars for the rest of the semester, I think. No, this is just the next one, the panel. Very interesting panel about the post-election policy agenda in Japan. I'll go through a little bit of the Zoom etiquette, which is also showing now. This session is being recorded as usual. And if you have questions when we get to the Q&A, you can either ask your question in the chat function, or you can use the raise hand button. Please, while Eunmi is speaking and while everyone else is speaking, please remain muted so that we don't have any background noise. And then if you're called upon to raise a question, then you can unmute. So without further ado, I'll turn to Eunmi.
Do you see my slide? Good. Thank you so much, Mary, for the kind introduction. Yeah, I wish I were there in person and catch up. I miss visiting Harvard. It's been a while. So the paper that I'm presenting today is a pretty new paper. So Mary may be thinking that, oh, what are you doing? There's no gender in the title. This is a new line of research that I've been planning to work on for a long while. And I have two collaborators on this paper, Jiuk at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and Hiroshi at Hitotsubashi University. The three of us, Hiroshi, Jiuk, and myself, have long been interested in understanding how the employment relations system in Japan is changing. In the past, either together or independently, We conducted research on various aspects of employment relations in Japan, including workplace gender inequality, corporate downsizing, shifts in payment systems, the impact of foreign investment on employment practices, and more. Through the past studies, we tried to trace how lifetime employment is changing and what is the impact of the change. When we started this new project on corporate elites, our primary interest was to examine the shifts in corporate leadership over the past 2.5 decades. We expected that who become corporate leaders, such as board members and CEOs, would have changed at large Japanese companies during the period of time when the usefulness of lifetime employment was questioned and profound environmental changes took place. Stories like Nissan hiring Carlos Ghosn as a CEO seem to highlight a change at the corporate leadership in Japan. We collected data on board members of Japanese companies listed in Tokyo Stock Exchange from 1992 to 2016 and analyzed CEO succession events. What we found from our data analysis was an astounding stability in the corporate leadership. Lifetimers have dominated the corporate board and the CEO positions at large Japanese companies, and there has been little to no change to their dominance since the early 1990s. This finding presented us a puzzle about no change. There is a long tradition of research on institutional change. In this literature, scholars consider exogenous shocks, such as economic crisis or other drastic political and social disruptions, as main drivers of institutional change. This approach, often called the punctuated equilibrium model, highlights discontinuity of changes. Gradual changes may also happen through the cumulative effect of incremental changes, even when exogenous shocks do not exist. But the general understanding is that exogenous shocks can drive institutional changes. A question that received little attention but can be very much relevant to the case of our interest is why exogenous shocks may fail to generate transformations as expected in the punctuated equilibrium model. Over the last 3 decades, Japanese companies underwent a turbulent period with a series of severe internal and external crises, starting with the collapse of the asset price bubble in 1992 and the ensuing stagnation, Asian financial crisis, as well as the banking crisis in Japan in 1997, 1998, the global financial crisis of 2008, and the great earthquake disaster of East Japan in 2011. The COVID-19 is certainly a critical shock, but it is beyond the observation window of this particular study. This is an impressive list of crises Japanese companies went through over the past 3 decades. Any one of these crises would well be considered a significant shock that could generate a substantive institutional change in a society. Throughout all these crises, however, corporate leadership of Japanese companies remained surprisingly stable. Specifically, all through the years, it continued to be dominated by internally groomed executives, so-called lifetimers, and external CEO hires have been extremely rare. Let me show you a graph to put things into perspective. Hiring a new CEO from outside the firm as a change agent to overcome financial distress or to implement strategic reorientation when environments are changing has become quite common across the globe. According to a report by PwC, 24% of the CEO succession events in the world's 2,500 largest public companies between 2012 and 2015, pretty recent, were outside succession. Those CEOs were hired directly from a company other than the one they currently lead. They have no work history with the companies they are currently leading. One notable exception is Japan, where the percentage of outsider CEO succession remains extremely low at 4%. The persistence of insider control at large Japanese companies is intriguing, given that the institutional foundations have been steadily disintegrating, most importantly, lifetime employment. I probably do not need to explain what lifetime employment looks like in Japan to this audience. Very briefly, under the lifetime employment system, employees were hired fresh out of college or high school in the past, trained through job rotations, paid based on seniority, promoted internally, and then retired. To be selected as a board executive of the company was seen as the ultimate prize for lifetime dedication. In this system, lifetimers were favored candidates for the CEO position, as they know the company inside out, and they are the symbols of success within the lifetime employment system. But there have been indications that lifetime employment has deteriorated since the economic stagnation took hold in the early 1990s, with more mid-career hirings and higher incidences of layoffs. Although the magnitude of these changes remains debated, but some changes have been detected. As the lifetime employment system changes, it is likely that the idea around who should be the leader of the company would change, we thought. We had a reason to believe so because external economic and societal changes can affect intra-organizational power relations. If lifetime employment is criticized, lifetime employees would not be seen relevant to lead a company, and their dominance would decline. Also, as the number of lifetime employees decreases, the pipeline for the leadership positions would change, paving a way for a new leadership. We did not find a meaningful change in leadership, however. Instead, we found that the dominance of lifetime employees at the top did not decline at all. Let me briefly explain who corporate leaders are in Japanese firms. There are three major groups. First, lifetimer executives, those who joined the company right after college graduation and spent their entire career there. Second, the mid-career executives are those who joined the company after working for other companies and then became board members after working for this current company for a while. The third group are executive directors who join the company as board members. Most of them come from places where the company has relationships with, such as the parent company, main bank, group member company, government agency, etc. We call this group institutionally embedded executives. Mary probably knows where this term came from, obviously inspired by her previous work. The first two groups, lifetimer executives and mid-career executives, are insiders as they have been working for the company before they became board members. The last group, the institutionally embedded executives, they came from outside the company and had no work history with the company. They are the outsiders. Among these three groups, lifetimer executives are the dominant group. In the Japanese context, where external CEOs are near non-existent, the next CEO is almost always selected from the current board members, which means that these three groups of directors are the contenders for the CEO position. This is a graph based on our data. I'll explain how the data were collected in a few slides. Our data shows that more than half of the board directors are lifetimer executives. There is a slight and steady decrease of lifetimer executives over the past 2.5 decades, but they are still an obvious majority. About 15% of the directors are institutionally embedded executives, the outsiders from outside the firm, and that number has been very much stable over the 2.5 decades. To explain the persistence of insider control, particularly lifetimer dominance, we draw insight from the political economic literature on dualization. We propose that dualized power relations lead to separate power dynamics for core and non-core group members. For core group members, the presence of external threats will create a strong sense of in-group cohesion and embolden their mobilization of intra-firm power resources to entrench themselves in leadership positions, leading to the institutionalization of their power. For non-core group members, in contrast, their lack of stable intra-firm power resources will make them vulnerable to external contingencies and thus subject to greater intra-group conflict, leading to the circulation of power among the non-core group members. I'll show you how we applied these theories to the Japanese context in the next slide. So we argue that these dualized power relations help buffer the insiders from external environmental changes. So in the Japanese context, the dualized power relations will lead to the institutionalization of lifetimer power, we argue. We hypothesize that in times of changes in the environment, lifetimers will mobilize their resources to continue to dominate in the CEO succession competition. The larger their presence at the top, the easier their mobilization will be. So we further hypothesize that the greater the influence of lifetimers on the board, the more likely a lifetime executive will become the next CEO. Unlikely the lifetimer executives, the mechanisms lifetime executives show, the outsiders, institutionally embedded executives, the non-core members of the corporate leadership, will circulate power among themselves as the Japanese corporate governance system changes, reflecting the collapse of the main bank system and the weakening of group-based cross-shareholdings. For example, executives from banks and group member companies are likely to lose their advantages over time in the competition for the next CEO. Those from parent companies, on the other end, may not experience such decline, but experience an increased advantage as other groups decline. So we test our hypothesis, the dualized power dynamics, using data on all executive board members at Tokyo Stock Exchange listed Japanese companies from 1992 to 2016. We collected the data from Yakuin Shikyo, published by Toyo Keizai Shinbosha. Here we excluded outside directors who are not executives of the firm, Shagayu Torishimari, as well as statutory auditors, Kanshayaku, as they did not have any chance to be the next CEO. In total, our data include almost 300,000 firm director years from over 60,000 directors at almost 1,800 companies. Let me emphasize this just one more time. Our data is not a sample. It includes the population of directors at TSE listed companies. And we analyze all the CEO succession events between 1992 and 2016. This is a massive amount of data that we collected. And believe it or not, I started collecting this data when I was still there at Harvard as a graduate student. Took many, many years to compile this kinds of data. And it's been a long process for all of us, three of us, to come here and to write this paper. And this is our very first paper coming out of this data set. So there will be more to come. So you can stay excited. This is a very exciting moment for us because it's been many years of a lot of data mining work. I want to highlight just one thing here. That we operationalized lifetime executives as those who joined the company within 2 years after college graduation and stayed with the company and then became executives. So we considered 2 years is short enough for us to safely assume that they are fresh graduates who did not have jobs at other companies, but we think that this is a very much a conservative measurement. And institutionally embedded executives are those who join the company as executive board members. And we also coded their prior employment so that we know whether they are coming from a parent company, bank, government agency, etc. And finally, the mid-career hires who became executives are used as the baseline category in the analysis. So we will see how the other two groups have advantages in the CEO competition compared to mid-career hires who became executives. And to measure lifetimers' influence on the board, on the executive board, we used two variables. One, whether the incumbent CEO is a lifetimer or not, and two, the proportion of lifetimers on the board. The higher the proportion is, the larger their influence is. We also included various control variables at the individual level, board level, and the firm level. I will not explain these variables for the sake of time. You can come back if there's any interest. Using event history analysis, we estimate the probability of lifetimers as well as institutionally embedded executives to be selected as the next CEO. I'll skip the technical explanation of the method. Happy to come back if anyone is interested. You saw this graph already. This shows a strong insider control. More than 80% of directors are insiders, mid-career hires and lifetimers combined. One point that I want to make here is that because we considered 2 years as the bar, so lifetime executives who joined the company within 2 years after college graduation are the lifetimers. That's how we operationalize this variable. If we relaxed this a little bit to like 3 years, 4 years, or 5 years, the proportion of lifetimer executives increases. So this really is a strict conservative measure. And even when we use this very strict measure, we find that lifetimers are the dominant group. Over 50% of the board directors are lifetimers. Then who becomes the CEO? Over 40% of the CEOs are, sorry, this is not right. Over 40% lifetimers are at the bottom. Over 40% of the CEOs are lifetimers. Over 20% are mid-careers. And the rest of around 35% are institutionally embedded executives. So those from outside have a high chance of becoming a CEO. Or in other words, although only 15% of the board members are institutionally embedded executives from outside, when they join the board, they actually have a very high chance to succeed the CEO position. There is a reason for them to join the company, even if they do not have any work history with the company. So our first findings, showing you only the first 2 lines, the table is much, much larger with a bunch of controls, as you can easily imagine. Supporting our first hypothesis, the findings show that compared to mid-career executives, lifetimer executives have a significantly higher chance to be selected as the next CEO. We also find that institutionally embedded executives have a significantly higher chance to be selected as a CEO. So it is the mid-career executives who have been at a very large disadvantage in the competition for the next CEO all through the years, 2.5 decades that we analyzed. Here is the visualization. Both the lifetimer and institutionally embedded executives have a higher chance to be the next CEO. The interpretation of the effect size here needs a little bit of caution. Although the coefficient, the size of the probability here is much larger for institutionally embedded executives, that does not necessarily mean that they are more likely to be selected than lifetimers, because there are simply a lot more lifetimer executives on the board to be selected. So that's why the coefficient is smaller for the lifetimer executives. Second finding here, the significant interaction terms here support our second hypothesis. When the incumbent CEO is a lifetimer, lifetimer executives have a significantly higher chance to be selected as the CEO, as the next CEO. We did not find that more lifetime executives on the board leads to a higher chance for lifetimers. But interestingly, lifetimer CEO significantly decreases the advantages institutionally embedded executives have. And both the incumbent CEO is a lifetime employee, lifetimer, and the proportion of lifetime executives on the board, both of them similarly decrease the probability of institutionally embedded executives to be selected as the next CEO. So to visualize the findings, under the lifetimer CEO, lifetimer executives have an advantage while institutionally embedded executives do not. But under a non-lifetimer CEO, institutionally embedded executives have a higher chance, have an advantage. Also, the chance of lifetimer executives does not vary much by the proportion of lifetimer executives on the board, but the chance of institutionally embedded executives varies significantly depending on how much the board is dominated by lifetimers. Lifetimer-dominated boards tend to block institutionally embedded executives from becoming the next CEO. Through these mechanisms, lifetimer dominance at the top is maintained. The other mechanism that we propose, the circulation of power, to test that hypothesis, we generated the interaction terms between the main terms and the annual time trend. And we found evidence to our third hypothesis about the circulation of power among outsiders. As you see here, lifetimer executives' advantage did not change over time at all. They maintained the advantage throughout the years from 1992 to 2016. We've tested this in many different ways. We did periodization and all other ways to test the effect of time trend. Absolutely no change over time. The significant interaction terms here show that the advantage of different types of institutionally embedded executives have changed over time, unlike the lifetimer executives. In particular, those from group companies and banks lost their advantages significantly. Executives from parent company gained advantage over time, although this coefficient is only marginally significant. But we visualize the results so that you can have a better sense of what's happening, and you will see how these three groups changed over time. So I marked the three groups of institutionally embedded executives. Those from group companies is in orange. They experienced a clear decline of the advantages. And those from banks, colored in light blue, they also experienced a clear decline in their advantages to become the next CEO. Those from parent companies, the dark blue line here, experienced an increase of advantages in the competition for the next CEO over the past 2.5 decades. These findings suggest that among the institutionally embedded executives, the power is circulated rather than being concentrated. Depending on the changes in the external environment, some rise and others fall. Through this circulation of power, Japanese companies adapt to external changes without sapping the dominance of lifetimers at the top. Not sure if I still have time left. I think I do. There was this really scary line from Shin's email that Eunmi must not speak more than 30 minutes. So I tried really hard to package this into 30 minutes. So let me briefly explain implications of our study. Our analysis of CEO succession outcomes in Japan demonstrates that even major economic and social crises may not trigger wholesale institutional change. Instead, our results suggest that resistance by organizational insiders combined with selective adaptation block transformations despite profound changes in the environment. We show that lifetimers successfully protected their dominance at the top through the turbulent period of various crises. And we cautiously raise a concern that this may lead to institutional drift, which means that pre-existing institutions that fail to change even when the environments change can lead to a gradual degradation of their standards and performance. This could be a significant risk of the continued dominance of lifetimers in corporate leadership when lifetime employment is questioned in times of external shocks. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Eunmi. One correction, I mistakenly said that Eunmi had been a postdoc in the US-Japan Relations Program, and actually the Reischauer Institute can claim that, that distinction. Eunmi was a postdoc at the Reischauer Institute. So thank you for the correction, Shane. All right, so this was a wonderful talk, and I have a couple of questions, but I'm going to turn first to two associates of the US-Japan Relations Program. First, Gabrielle Chung, who's a postdoctoral fellow in the program, and Gabrielle received her PhD from the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Southern California. So Gabrielle, would you like to pose the first question?
Thank you so much, Professor Brinton, and thank you very much to Professor Mun for your inspiring talk. My question is from a more from the perspective of evidence-based policy. I'm curious as to what the implications of your study may be for legislation to promote greater gender diversity in the workplace in Japan. Thank you so much.
Can I respond or do I wait?
Yes, yes, please.
Thank you so much for the question. So you can wait for our second paper on that point. We were really interested in analyzing the gender aspect of corporate elites. But as you can easily imagine, there are only so few women on the executive board. We could not actually analyze the data. This is not a joke, seriously. We have so little variation. There are only so few cases that we couldn't actually run regression analysis. That's why we had to rethink about what to do with gender analysis. And we will work on it, we have ideas. But so broadly speaking, one, women are extremely underrepresented at the leadership position. For fact, in the past 2.5 decades, only 2 to 3% of board member positions are held by women. So we did many different things that if we consider that if there are, so how many companies have at least one woman out of all the corporate board members, then it's about 10% of the Japanese companies have at least one woman on the leadership, in the leadership positions. So that's what we may be analyzing. That number has been increasing though in the very recent years, arguably the impact of Abenomics. But the number actually has been increasing quite rapidly in the past 3 to 4 years. So it's quite encouraging in that sense. But you know that we talked about in this paper how it's an insider control. It's actually an active resistance. It's not like nobody does nothing and the institution stays the way it is. It actually requires and involves a lot of effort from the insiders to protect their power and dominance. And these insiders are mostly men, almost always men. So it's the combination of gender dominance in the corporate leadership position. So it requires some kind of effort. You cannot really wait and see what happens. And there will be some kind of meaningful transformation in the corporate leadership. And we will see more women. It's very unlikely. There will be a pretty clear implication from our analysis that what we see as an outcome, a no change, is not something that just happens naturally. It requires a lot of actions and efforts.
Thank you so much. Let me turn next to Tomoka Miyachi, who's a professor in the Faculty of Commerce at Takushoku University. So Professor Miyachi.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. My question is about job mobility. Internationally, Japan has a low level of job mobility, but how should we think about the desired level of job mobility? Is low job mobility a good thing or a bad thing for the average Japanese employee?
Yeah, well, you're completely right. That Japan still shows one of the lowest job mobility rate amongst all the OECD countries. But that's an empirical fact. Whether it's a good thing or not is a little tricky question, I'd say. What we were very interested in this research was not to say whether it's a good thing or not, but to understand what are the kind of outcomes or impact of having the same people having a very homogeneous backgrounds at the top when the environments are changing, when the kind of changes or some kind of reinvention or some kind of reorientation is almost desired or expected. We have a majority of corporate leaders who have a very homogeneous background, very similar values, similar kind of knowledge. What would be the kind of impact? So that was what we were really interested. And in this paper that I presented, we do not have that kind of outcome. What are the kind of corporate outcomes when the companies have very similar homogeneous group of leaders? But that's something that we will be working on as our sort of follow-up paper. So what will be the impact of having a very stable, homogeneous group of corporate leaders who don't move around? So what will be the impact of it? So that will be something that we find really interesting and also meaningful to study. So I cannot say whether it's a good thing or not to have low job mobility, but having a low job mobility does have some kind of impact. And in the case of corporate leadership positions, when those people are very homogeneous, who do not move around, do not have experience outside the company, it may have some kind of impact on their corporate policies, their decisions, etc.
Okay, thank you. I have a couple of questions and I'll ask those and then we'll turn to the broader audience. So Eunmi, when you talked about your theoretical framework, you said you presented a framework where external threats create in-group cohesion. But the theory seems to apply to Japan, but not to other countries. Because of the initial bar chart that you showed us with the so much more circulation, right, of power in other countries among the board directors. So why? I mean, the theory seems to be tailored to this specific case.
Yeah.
While you think about that, I had a simpler question, which was the graph circulation of power among institutionally embedded executives. I think this is a really, really revealing graph. I just didn't quite understand what the vertical axis is from 0% to 600%. So if you could clarify that.
Oh, so that's the probability compared to the, so the baseline category there is always the mid-career executives, those people who are higher, the chutosayo people who became executives. They are at obvious disadvantage in the competition for the next CEO. And then compared to their probability of becoming the CEO, how the probability of each of those groups look like.
Okay, thank you.
That 600 percentage though is slightly misleading because we had to impose log linear graph to visualize the outcomes. So if you remember this very high chance early in the 1990s, that slightly misleading. So the later part of the graph is more truthful to the actual data. It's just a little bit of a drastic graph that we had to impose to visualize the results.
Yeah.
So the big question, the first one, okay. So when Mary asks questions to me, I still feel like I'm going back to my graduate days and like, oh my goodness, my advisor asked me this hard question. I have to give her the right answer. So this is a question that we have been thinking a lot about, like a lot. This is the core question that we need to figure out because this is a Japan paper. And you know how I feel about this, that when we write a paper on a case that has its own history and its own uniqueness going on, then providing a generalizable theory, it's a wonderful thing that we would also want to do is so that we can publish papers in a journal. But it is a very unique case. Japan has a very unique conditions, and the outcomes are also really unique. And the general theories don't explain the case. They are not even interested. So we were going through all the institutional change literature, and there was this line from this very influential chapter written by Wolfgang Strigg and Captain Phelan. And there was this line that exactly this case, that the survival of institutions despite exogenous shocks, they are not interested. That's the line we saw. They are not interested in explaining this case. It's not as interesting as
political scientists are not
political scientists. Papers. I mean, like we are heavily influenced by their studies, and that's why we are asking the question here, building on their theoretical questions and all that. But this is a case that has not been relevantly studied, that has not been understood. And the theoretical framework is out there, it's not, it doesn't really explain what we are observing. So the theory of threat with how the external threat sort of generates in-group cohesion, this is a theory that we are adopting from the sort of scholars who have a psychology background. So this theory is called the threat rigidity. When there are threats outside, and then that sort of influences behaviors of not only individuals but also companies. So we are figuring out how the decision-making process is influenced by the perceived threat.
I see.
Outside.
I see.
So so in a sense, yes, you're completely right. We use a theory and tailor it to explain the empirical case that we are observing. We really want to explain what is happening in Japan, particularly in formulations in Japan. And we have been basically failing all through these years to find the right theoretical framework. That's why we have been getting rejected from journals, because they thought that, there was this disconnect between the way we think about what we need as a theoretical framework to explain the Japanese case and what people who are not very familiar with the Japanese case think as general theory. So you are completely right. We are tailoring these theories to explain the Japanese case. It could be, I think, both strength and weakness of our paper. So we are betting our luck on this new theory.
Well, I think before I turn to the next question, which is going to be posed by Koichi Ai, I mean, I think you've pointed to a very interesting dilemma, if I can say that, in the literature on institutions, which is that the theories are not about institutional stability. They're about institutional change, right? And so I see what you mean. They're really predictive of change. And actually a paper written number of years ago by Orlando Patterson in our department about cultural persistence is exactly about this, that the theories are not predicting persistence, right? So, and Eunmi as a kind of editorial comment, forgive me, Eunmi has pointed to a very, very important question or dilemma for young scholars of Japan in the social sciences, and that is, how do you frame a paper so that it's appealing to a broader audience that's not specifically a Japan audience? And this is what you need to do to establish a scholarly career in political science and sociology. The attempt of Eunmi and her co-authors reflects again, these pressures by the major scholarly journals to use Japan as a case of something, but not focus exclusively on the Japanese case, because not everybody's interested in the Japanese case. So anyway, thank you for that answer. And I realize it's a difficult question.
Yeah, I didn't mean to share my frustration, but that's where we are sort of at, because initially we were really interested in finding changes, and we
Sure.
framed the whole paper based on the changes with the tiny little bit of change. And then the responses that we got was that, well, what you show is there's no change. Why would you even say that there is a change?
Right.
And it was a kind of, a moment of realization that, yeah, we need to tell a story that's truthful
About stability.
Yeah, that's what is happening in Japan. Then that's what we need to theoretically frame, and provide a new framework to explain stability. So that's exactly where we are at.
So we shouldn't go on in a I'm sorry, Eunmi was advising, so we're used to talking for a long time. But let me turn to Koichi Ai for his question.
Oh, thank you very much. And this is extremely fascinating presentation. I enjoyed it thoroughly. I work for public sector, but my wife is in banking sector, and this presentation very much summarized 30 years worth of my listening to her complaints. Oh, but anyway, I think you should be frustrated by the fact that you found no change in the end result, because I think the beef of the study should be in why this is the case. And I would be very much interested in your thoughts on why this has been the case, at least in the past 3 decades. Is it simply the tribal instinct of the executives at the top to choose someone very much like themselves as their successors, or does it have anything to do with more general, uniquely Japanese approach to human resource management? Because after all, if you're talking about the insiders, they are the people who spend 30 odd years climbing up the ladder, and there's been selection process all throughout. So how do you see this results, whether it comes from just the top mentality or more general organizational trend? And the second part is that, do you plan to expand this research further into perhaps analyzing the individual companies' corporate performance through these years to their trend in selection of the CEOs? I mean, normally you would think that if your company is not performing, you would seek change. But apparently those companies who've been doing well, as well as those companies who are not doing well, have chosen to take the similar path in terms of changing selecting their leadership. So would you be interested in going deeper into this aspect of whether certain companies with certain CEOs are prone to have better results? Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for your very thoughtful questions.
And Eunmi, if you could limit yourself to 4 or 5 minutes, that would be great, so that we can take another question afterwards.
Sure, absolutely. So the second question is the answer is yes, but I would say that the direction that we are getting into after this paper is less about the performance of each organizations, but more about the malfeasance of companies. So there are two different ways of thinking about corporate outcomes or corporate performance. The ROA, the business as usual kind of outcomes, how much money companies raise. So that's one way to think about companies' performance, and that has been widely utilized, widely analyzed. So, well, it's technically possible to analyze those outcomes. We could probably do it, but what we are more interested in is that it's not the kind of monetary outcomes or performance, but more like the kind of decisions companies make are more influenced by the characteristics of the corporate leadership. So we are in the process of collecting data on how these companies, publicly traded companies, have been involved in some kind of fraud or other related corporate scandals and things like that. All levels of corporate malfeasance. So that's the direction that we are getting into right now. The first question is a difficult question. Because the second question, I can answer anything, right? I can do anything. I can go any kind of routes. So the scholarly kind of response to your question about why it is the case, why in Japan the corporate leaders, insiders could protect themselves so successfully throughout all these years. The scholarly answer that I provide in this presentation in a very concise, condensed version is that the Japanese system, in a sense, had a buffer. The non-core of them, the outsider directors, the institutionally embedded directors, they have sort of functioned in a way to clean up the mess. So they came from outside, although they have some kind of, they are coming from places where the company has had relationships like main bank or parent company, group companies, but mostly they came as kind of, people who will rescue the company when the company is in financial distress or some kind of failure. That had happened in the past, even under the main bank system. The executives from the main bank will come and figure out what happened in this company that the main bank lent so much money. So the executive from the main bank will try to do some kind of reform in the company and try to make a turnaround and somehow get the company into the right direction. That kind of stories were quite common. So that 15% of the outsider executives, institutionally embedded executives, they have functioned in a way to buffer the kind of external threats that could have been imposed on the core members, the insiders. So they could be sort of, they could protect themselves by allowing some of these outsiders to manage the environmental changes. So that's the kind of structural explanation we have in our mind, and that's how we are kind of framing the whole process mechanism in this paper. But this may sound a little too technical or scholarly, and you may still have, but how still did they make it possible to protect themselves for so many years with all kinds of crises taking place? And this is not a scholarly answer at all. It's my own take and to your question. So Ronald Dorr once said that corporate leaders in other countries would steal money for themselves. They would be involved in some kind of fraud for themselves to get themselves more money. In Japan, if corporate leaders are involved in that kind of fraud or some kind of malfeasance, problematic behaviors, it's mostly for their company. It's not for themselves individually trying to get more money in their pocket. So this is different from the mentality kind of explanation, but there have been different kind of corporate culture that have been developed all through these years in Japan. And it's not some kind of individual level failure that these leaders are not working hard, trying to steal money from company, things like that. They have been working really hard to sustain the whole company that has been going on all through these years. And I think it's a combination of the structural, the structure of the corporate leadership that has buffer, and also the core members that have been trying really hard for the success of the company, that sort of gave them the kind of stories and legitimacy to maintain their power. So I think that there are many things that are combined into this stability story. It's not just one thing that sustains everything. There's the kind of corporate culture they developed, the way the board operates, the kind of symbolic power the lifetimers have in the company, the roles they play in the company, and the way they try to manage external shocks, environmental changes in their own best. It all contributed to the current outcome of stability.
Okay, thank you so much. We have time for just one more question, I think. This is from Chinami Iokibe, and her question is as follows. I have a question about the low relative advantage of mid-career hires in top management succession. Mid-career hires have increased by 10 percentage points over the past 25 years. This increasing trend will accelerate further in the future as the digital revolution progresses. From that perspective, I am interested in the future development of the relative advantage of mid-career hires. Could you let me know if there are similar considerations for US companies?
Right. So the mid-careers, totally true. Mid-career hires are increasing. It's one of the things that are considered as the signs of changes in the lifetime employment system. I think that is also sort of reflected in our chart, our graph that I showed you, that there is a steady, although slow and small size, decline of lifetimers and a slight increase of mid-career hires on the board positions. So that's sort of reflected. But if we considered mid-career hires who joined the company within 5 years of college graduation, even if they had another company that they experienced before joining, and if you consider them as the sort of very close to lifetimers kind of group, there's not much of change in our graph. So I think there is a fine line between the mid-career hires, in a sense, is a very heterogeneous group. So some of them joined the company very early. Some of them had longer history with other companies and then joined later. So it's a kind of mixed bag group that we need to further investigate, and how we can understand sort of newly growing group of employees in Japanese companies. But one thing that's very clear from our analysis, at least, is that no matter what, even this very strict definition of 2 years after graduation that we consider as lifetimers, mid-career hires, if they joined 3 years after their graduation, 4 years after their graduation, they have a very clear, significant disadvantage in the competition for the next CEO. So we consider that's kind of still going on, likely to be the case for a while. In the US case, I think it will be a very surprising finding to a lot of people who are not familiar with the Japanese context. We presented these results to a few other audiences in other conferences. Mostly what shocks the audience who do not know the Japanese context is that this mid-career group who joined the company are at the disadvantage, and there's so many people who joined the company within 2 years after college graduation and stayed there for such a long time. it has become not very common, particularly in the United States, that people stay with the same company for such a long time. In age 30, a lot of US employees would have experienced at least 3 to 4 different employers. So the context is vastly different, I'd say. So there's the second question about the comparison between the Japan and the US. There is a very clear difference between Japanese employees and the US employees, the way they experience different workplaces. Mary, I think you are muted.
Thanks. I think we'll have to close. It's already 1 o'clock, a little bit after. But thank you very much for this presentation and for the questions that you generated among audience members. And we will look forward to the future papers that you can write out of this fabulous data set. So thank you very much for joining us today, Eunmi.
Thank you so much for having me today.